Well, thank you, Ray. Today, I'd like to look at the questions of biases and heuristics from a different way than we often do. You know, the work of Kahneman, Tversky, and Thaler brought them the Nobel Prize, and it's helped us to focus on our biases and our perceptions and our use of heuristics or unconscious rules of thumb when we make decisions. And in the world of insights, we're pretty conscious of the implications of what that means for respondents and how we ask questions. We know that stated importance will only reveal maybe what's socially acceptable, probably would mislead us if we took it at face value. And we know that asking why will really just get us a socially acceptable answer that is really got nothing to do with the way we actually made a decision. And behavioral economics really does reveal a great deal about consumer choices. But we're often blind to the fact that as insights professionals, that we are subject to exactly the same biases. We use heuristics all the time. That has implications for our analyses. Unchecked, our biases and heuristics can lead us to the wrong conclusion. It can allow us to assume that our hunches are right and encourage us to think that what we see is really all there is. It's a weakness that we don't often consider, and the results can be crippling. And in fact, if we look to other professions, like doctors or lawyers or intelligence analysts or other groups like that, we can see that the results of cognitive biases can have profound implications and play out all the time and aren't easy to defeat. So if we look at something like physicians, we know that there are misdiagnoses that are driven from confirmation bias or tunnel vision that in the U.S. alone account for, depending upon whose estimate you look at, somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 deaths a year. And that's not taking into account the number of people that are mistreated, undertreated, otherwise escape, but have been affected by physicians' cognitive biases. Analyses of wrongful convictions have shown that most of those, about 80% by one estimate, are due to cognitive bias, tunnel vision. What you see is all there is as a bias. It's not necessarily that the prosecutors were malicious or the police wanted to frame the wrong guy. It really is that people have a hunch and then look for evidence that supports that. And that has very profound implications. And if you think about intelligence analysts and the blind spots that they develop, it can result in everything from Pearl Harbor to missing the Arab Spring and misunderstanding it. These can have very profound effects, and it's something that we, as a group, really need to understand. I've undertaken a study of how other sense makers grapple with bias and how they generate insights. And I've looked to all of the communities that I've mentioned earlier, and it's been an incredibly interesting investigation that's led to a new book that's coming out later this month in North America and in May in Europe called Eureka, The Science and Art of Insights. And in that, I unpack things that I've learned from the different types of sense makers. The intelligence community is one that has been grappling with this for a very long time. So this quote from Richard Heuer from his book published by the CIA, The Psychology of Intelligence Analysis, he says, intelligence analysts must understand themselves before they can understand others. And I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. Interestingly, Richard Heuer, who wrote this particular book in 1999, and while it's older, it's an absolute classic. It is available for free from the CIA website, and I would heartily recommend downloading it and reading it. In it, he goes through the work of Kahneman and Tversky and others in terms of cognitive biases. He first met Kahneman and Tversky and became aware of their work in the late 70s, when, after he had spent 24 years as a spy, he came into the analyst side of the CIA and was tasked with helping them update their methodologies. He met at a conference an Israeli intelligence analyst who had the same remit. That intelligence analyst was very well aware of Kahneman and Tversky's work because Kahneman had started out, in fact, as a psychologist. His first job was with Israeli defense. And Tversky, while being a psychologist, was also, as everyone was at that time, also in the Israeli army, and was in fact the commander of a paratroop battalion. So they were very much on the radar of Israeli intelligence, who then conveyed that information to the CIA, and they started studying biases. In this book, The Psychology of Intelligence Analysis goes through the implications of biases and heuristics for analysts in a really in-depth and interesting way, and also outlines a structured analytic technique, or multiple structured analytic techniques, which attempt to combat these biases. The reality is that we are pattern-seeking machines. We see patterns whether they're there or not. When I was working on this book, I was at the cottage, went outside to a beautiful starry night, and it was incredible how many stars there are. But my mind immediately went to look at the Big Dipper and Orion's Belt and other constellations and started to think about those stories. Now, we are projecting those stories onto something that really isn't a pattern. We have this innate need to create a story, to explain patterns, and that can have some really unfortunate consequences. There's research that shows that habitual gamblers are actually more prone to see patterns where there are none. And really, schizophrenia is our pattern-seeking tendency gone awry. Let's take a look at this. What's it say? Paris in the spring, once in a lifetime, bird in the hand, right? No, it doesn't. It says Paris in the spring, once in a lifetime, bird in the hand. Because we want to see a pattern that conforms to what we expect, we will miss data. We really can't believe everything that we think. We are blind to our own blind spots. Right now, you're looking at the screen, and you don't see the fact that your eye actually has a blind spot. Your brain fills in the spaces. Your eye moves around and picks up fresh data and then extrapolates. In reality, we can only see what's directly in front of us. We have an illusion that we see the whole room, and that's fueled by us moving our eyes around, but we in fact don't perceive the whole room at the same time. And in fact, we don't even see more than one color at any one time. But because our eyes move and we pick up fresh data, our mind will fill in the blanks. We are blind to our own cognitive biases. We can't do anything about it either. So if we look at this example of an optical illusion, optical illusions are basically the visual cousins of our own cognitive biases. The line is exactly the same in both those cases. I've measured it multiple times. I know that's true, but when I look at those lines, I cannot see them as being the same length. I just can't. We are very subject to what you see is all there is, which is a bias that Kahneman describes. Our system one thinking loves a simple, coherent story, and it naturally doesn't reach out to have a different kind of understanding. We satisfice because it's easy, and most of the time that's all we need. But that's not true when it comes to generating insights. We can't just go with, oh, that makes sense, and what I see makes sense, and therefore that's the right conclusion. We need to develop insights, and insights are different than research findings. Insights are about combining pieces of information. They are what the Cambridge Dictionary defines as a clear, deep, and sometimes sudden understanding. Insights come from making multiple connections, from thinking beyond the obvious and the familiar, from making new connections. And it's a process that I describe in Eureka, the science and art of insights. But I don't have time to go into the sort of insight aspect of it very much today. Our concern today is how to combat bias. And the bad news is that there is no easy fix. Lots of people have grappled with this, and there is no simple fix. The good news is that others have devised tactics that can help mitigate the problem. One of the most common ones, and one that I think has huge implications for us as a research industry, is the use of teamwork. So think about rounds in hospitals. Part of the purpose of rounds is to help remove that blindness to your confirmation bias or your tunnel vision. Part of it also is to open you up to fresh ideas about how you might treat a patient. It works. Peer review in the hard and soft sciences is everywhere, and it's there for a reason. But in our world of market research, that's often not the case. Often it's an individual analyst working away, maybe with their boss, who's probably coming from very much the same point of view and has some of the same assumptions and biases. And then we go forward, but we don't necessarily consult widely. And that can be problematic, and is problematic. And to be honest, if I look back over the years, I can see where I've been blind to other possibilities because I was focused on finding data that confirmed rather than challenged my own assumptions. One of the things that the CIA did, and Hears proposes in his book, The Psychology of Intelligence Analysis, is an 8-step process called the analysis of competing hypotheses, and it's a structured analytic technique. Step 1 is to identify, quote, the possible hypotheses to be considered. Use a group of analysts with different perspectives to brainstorm the possibilities. So what he's saying is right from before you gather any data, you think about what the possible hypotheses are, and not just one, but you force yourself to generate multiple hypotheses. That's a good first step in terms of combating bias. But he also says use a group of analysts with different perspectives to brainstorm the possibilities. So that means getting people from different parts of the business to provide you input while you think about the problem before you even start any sort of data collection. And the diversity of the team is really important. The more narrow or more similar the people are, the more likely they are to share the same kind of blind spots or biases. But the more diverse the group, the easier it is to step outside and bring a fresh perspective. That's incredibly important, and I think instructive for us as an industry. Second principle that seems to work is doubt. Questioning oneself. Again, as the structured analytic techniques suggest, step outside and question yourself. So step 2 in the analysis of competing hypotheses is make a list of significant evidence and arguments for and against each hypothesis. Then 3, prepare a matrix of hypotheses across the top and evidence down the side, and then question the diagnosticity of each of those. Then refine that, then draw tentative conclusions, and then analyze whether these conclusions are really sensitive to a couple of pieces of data or whether they're supported by a broad array of things. And then what the CIA and others do, MI6, is then circulate reports throughout the organization, getting input from different departments so that they have a more refined perspective. This doubt also works even if you just question yourself. Philip Tetlock, who's done some great work on forecasting, in his book, Super Forecasters, talks about a study he did in which they asked their forecasters to first make their forecast and then to actively doubt themselves, question it, and come up with a second forecast. What they found was that the resulting forecast in between those two, the first and then the doubted judgment, was actually more accurate than either the first or the second one. And he charmingly describes that as the wisdom of the inner crowd. So we've all heard of the wisdom of the crowd and crowdsourcing, but this is essentially replicating that in one's own mind. And then checklists are another tool. that are often used in complicated situations just because they remind us to stop and think. So here's a checklist that I proposed that's from the book. So do we learn from feedback? Do we get input from a diverse team? Do we actively doubt our conclusions? Do we test out multiple ideas? And do we have a broad range of evidence? All good questions that we should really consider when we're doing our analysis. Teamwork is interesting and not only helps check our bias, but can actually open us up to new ideas. And there's some great work by a researcher named Kevin Dunbar who's looked at science teams and found that he was an ethnologist and observed them. He found that when the team was more diverse, that the ideas were stronger because people were bringing in fresh information, being able to draw new analogies. So teamwork can not only help us fight bias, it can help us generate fresh insights. Our reality is that we're subject to the same biases and heuristics as our respondents. It bedevils our analysis whether we are aware of it or not. But by looking to other sense makers, we can see that teamwork, doubt, and structured analytic techniques like checklists can help us both curb bias and deepen insights. I look forward to your questions.